This video is brought to you with the support of TrueFire. Practice smart and play hard with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5 Watt World. We're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. Like many of you, my first good guitar was an Epiphone. Before that, I was playing on a borrowed guitar, but with money I made working on an apple farm, I'd saved enough to buy a 1974 Japanese-built 12-string acoustic. It's been uphill ever since. Epiphone has been thought of as a lesser cousin to Gibson, though that's changing again. But Epiphone is one of the oldest and best guitar companies in the country. At one time, a top competitor of Gibson and Gretsch, all along before Fender was even on the scene. This video will give you the full arc of the company's history, from the early 1900s to the years of import-only business, the new higher-end Epiphones being built today. So if you've always wondered how we got here, you're in the right place, because this is the 5 Watt World short history of Epiphone guitars. If you like this style of video, be sure to subscribe. And to support what we do, grab a t-shirt, hoodie, or a 5 Watt World Barber Collaboration overdrive pedal. To become an even bigger part of 5 Watt World, sign up for the Friends of 5 Watt on Patreon. There's a friend level to suit any budget. And if you've always wanted to have your own YouTube channel but didn't know where to start, buy my YouTube Mastery for Musicians course. It's all the things I wish I knew when I started. All the links are in the description. Founded by Anastasios Stathopoulos in Smyrna, Turkey in 1890, political tensions there led him to move his family and his instrument building business to the US in 1903. They arrived at the beginning of the mandolin boom, and as mandolins were similar to instruments he'd built in Turkey, he began building roundback mandolins. His label said it all: Stathopoulos, repair of all kinds of musical instruments. When Anastasios died unexpectedly in 1913, running the company fell to his 22-year-old son, Epi. Epi was both an exceptional craftsman and an accomplished musician on both mandolin and banjo. His family had also seen to his education, putting him through Columbia University. He loved to dress up and go out on the town, and his wife had been a performer with the Ziegfeld Follies. His close ties to the music scene in New York gave him the jump on companies like Gibson in both the tenor banjo and mandolin craze of the late teens. Shortly after incorporating in 1923, the company would adopt the name Epiphone, taken from a line of tenor banjos that Epi had designed. They were very successful for what would later be called the Dixieland Jazz era. That was all the rage in the 1920s. Epiphone issued its first guitars in 1928, the recording models. They had an innovative cutaway lower bout and a distinctive banjo-like headstock. Across the same time, Gibson had been founded in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1890, and by the 1920s had built a reputation in guitars and mandolins with carved tops much like a violin. In 1922, Gibson's Lloyd Loar replaced the traditional oval soundhole on a guitar with a pair of violin-style F-holes as Gibson introduced the L5 model. By the late 20s, Gibson dominated the archtop guitar market. Epi saw the future was in archtop guitars and went full-on up against Gibson. Heading into the 30s, Epiphone was building more traditionally shaped flat-top guitars as well. They launched their first electric models in the fall of 1935. Although Gibson had started building electric Hawaiian guitars a few months earlier, Epiphone was the first to sell an electric Spanish-style guitar played upright on your lap. To develop their amplifier line, they would hire a young engineer named Nate Daniel. Daniel's Elector amps were featured in the earliest advertising. Daniel would famously go on to found his own guitar brand in the 50s, Dan Electro. In 1939, Epiphone launched a full line of archtop guitars, ranging in price from $50 to $275. In all areas, they tried to one-up Gibson. They built guitars that were slightly larger and hence a little bit louder than the Gibson flagship models. Released in 1940, the top-of-the-line deluxe model was designed as an L5 killer. Maple back and sides, slightly larger lower bout, and all the fancy ornamentation one would expect from a guitar that cost nearly $300, smack in the middle of the Depression. The early 40s were a boom time for Epiphone, with their peak years of production as a standalone company. Their guitars were some of the best being built anywhere in the world, as proven by how many of the examples still exist in playable form today. Going into the 40s, Epiphone was a very successful and head-to-head competitor with Gibson. But World War II pulled workers away from instrument building, and Epiphone moved to producing items in support of the military. Another blow to the business was the Epi being diagnosed with leukemia in 1942, and he died just a year later. Running the company then fell to his two sons. Epiphone never again regained the production levels of the pre-war years. They had problems with labor, and a strike in '51 shut them down for many months. Gibson had faced many of the same issues with production and labor in the 40s and 50s. The big difference came in 1948 when Chicago Musical Instrument Company, that now controlled Gibson, decided to hire Ted McCarty as Gibson's new president. McCarty made Gibson profitable within a month of arriving in Kalamazoo. And while McCarty was certainly aware of the status of Epiphone and Gretsch in the market, he had his eyes fixed on Fullerton, California, and the new competition from the Fender Musical Instrument Company. I recount in detail McCarty's role in the development of the Les Paul. So I'll simply say that if Epiphone had better post-war leadership, they too might have transitioned to building excellent solid-body electric guitars. In fact, Epiphone had a longer relationship with Les Paul, as he'd played their guitars throughout the 1940s. But Epiphone was in bad shape. The brothers had had a falling out, and they left the running of the company to others. In the mid-50s, Gibson was very focused on the new solid-body guitar market. By '54, they had 4 different Les Paul models competing with Fender's Esquire, Telecaster, and Stratocaster. Gretsch had launched their Duojet, and Harmony, K, and National all had budget-priced solid bodies in their lines. But not Epiphone. So as players moved from their archtops to solid body on these newfangled television screens, Epiphone was already on the downward slide, and their fate was sealed. Epiphone had an upright bass division that had been out-competing Gibson. While McCarty was on a wood-buying trip in Washington State in 1957, Epiphone called saying that they were interested in selling. McCarty thought that they were buying the bass division alone, but in fact, the $20,000 price bought the entire company. So in 1957, Gibson purchased the Epiphone company in total, the factory in New York, the machines, the stock, and the brand name. In the end, the basses didn't work out for Gibson, but McCarty saw an opportunity in using the brand's name. He saw it as a chance to offer a second line to expand Gibson's dealer base while retaining the exclusivity of the Gibson name. He moved production of the Epiphone instruments to the same factory as the Gibsons in Kalamazoo. The idea was to make Epiphones almost as good as their Gibson counterparts. If the Gibson model had full-size humbuckers, the Epiphone model would have a mini humbucker. In the end, the differences would be often so subtle that they were lost on the marketplace. The plan for the new Epiphone line came together in a meeting in February of 1958. They used the old Epiphone model names, Century, Zephyr, and Emperor, but with the guitars now having distinctly Gibson-y shapes, all moving to the new thin line format. Notes from the meeting went so far as to refer to the new deluxe shape as being like the Gibson ES335, that would also be released that year. The new Epiphone flat tops were more easily compared to Gibson models. Only the maple-bodied, square-shouldered Frontier didn't have a direct sibling in the Gibson line. The Texan, with single parallelogram inlays, was a slightly fancier version of Gibson's J45 or J50, but in most every other way, they were the same guitar. Despite the plan to set up Epiphone as a less expensive alternative, the price for a Texan and a J45 were the same at $135 for the Sunburst version at release. By '63, the flat-top line had grown to include 8 models, with a high-end Excelente, the square-shouldered mahogany Eldorado, the maple Troubadour, the small-bodied Folkster, and a pair of 12-strings, the Bard and the Serenader. This was also true of the big archtop offerings. The Epiphone Emperor model was added to the line in '59. In '60, it was priced at $650 in Sunburst, the same price as Gibson's Super 400 that year. This ran true across the hollow body line up into the Triumph, and the Zenith models, also priced like their counterparts in the Gibson line. Much of this success was due to McCarty's and his team's vision for Epiphone, but in '57, they hired Andy Nelson as a salesman and clinician. But Nelson saw Epiphone as its own brand, and he was responsible for the look of the solid body Epiphones to come. The Wilshire and the Cornet models came from his vision of a very different solid body, not taken from the Gibson playbook. They also issued electric basses starting in '59 with the semi-hollow Rivoli, effectively a Gibson EB2. It was followed by the solid body Newport in '63. McCarty pushed his team hard, and the new Epiphones were debuted at the NAMM show in the summer of '58. With the Sheridan at the top of the line with the ornamentation one would expect, it was Epiphone's equivalent of the very fancy Gibson ES355. On the other end of the Epi line was the solid-body entry-level Cornet, selling for just $120. Initially offered with a single New York single-coil pickup with the cherry or black finish, and what would come to be called the bikini logo on the headstock. The cornet ran in a number of configurations from 59 to 70, and then on and off in reissues since. When Gibson overhauled their Les Paul line in 61, many humbuckers replaced the New York-style pickup on the high-end Epiphone solid-body models, and the P90s were used on the lower-end cornet models. In 63, the Epiphone Crestwood solid bodies received a makeover with a thinner, asymmetrical double cutaway shape and a fender-like 6-on-a-side peghead. There were 9 solid-body guitars in all, running from the Olympic Junior at $109 to the Crestwood Deluxe at $425. When Gibson started offering custom colors on their Firebirds, Epiphone added California Coral, Sunset Yellow, and Pacific Blue in addition to the standard finishes available. By 63, they'd added classical guitars as well, priced from $109 to $325. Initially, sales of the new line were modest, with just 226 guitars shipped in 59. But by 60, they'd gone above 2,000 a year. In 61, they shipped 3,906 guitars. In 62, they shipped 4,788 guitars. By 1965, the only year in Gibson's past when they shipped over 100,000 instruments, 19,000, or nearly 20%, were Epiphones. It was this growth that encouraged them to expand their line. So in 1961, echoing the Gibson's ES330 from a couple years before, Epiphone introduced the Casino. I've been using TrueFire for years, so they were the perfect partner for 5-Watt World. I'm interested in all kinds of music, and TrueFire always has something to scratch the itch I have for learning more about guitar. To take full advantage of the variety, I subscribe to the All Access Pass, which lets me use everything in the TrueFire catalog. I've learned so much from TrueFire that I'm confident that you can too. As a viewer of 5-Watt World, you get an exclusive 50% discount on the All Access Pass by using the links in the description. Sign up to support 5-Watt World and get some great lessons at the same time. Practice smart and play hard with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this video. The Casino shared the double cutaway design of the Gibson ES335 style guitars, but with the fully hollow design of the ES330. At first, the model lived in the shadows of the higher priced models, but in '64, Paul McCartney bought a Casino in Britain. McCartney's use of a Casino is one of the most often cited as driving sales, but Keith Richards was actually the first, having bought and used a similar '62 Casino months earlier than Paul. With the Rolling Stones' early success, Keith Richards was able to buy multiple new guitars. In May '64, he bought a 1962 Epiphone Casino ES230 TDV. It was one of the early guitars with the original style headstock. Built in the Gibson plant in Michigan, it was a 16-inch wide hollow body, 5-ply maple birch maple laminate, sunburst finished, mahogany neck, and a bound rosewood fingerboard. It had a 24 3/4-inch scale length, and the neck met the body at the 16th fret, requiring less of a reach than that of a 335's 19th fret to the body. It had 2 volume and 2 tone controls and a 3-way pickup selector switch. When introduced in '61, the Casino listed for $275 or $314 with the vibrato. According to Gibson Records, just 211 Casino ES230 TDB models were shipped in '62. Richards' Casino became his main guitar, and he used extensively on tour and in the studio. Keith loved the guitar, but as the volume at shows increased, the fully hollow body began to feed back, and he moved to using a '59 Les Paul, another first for a British band. Paul McCartney bought his '62 Casino in preparation for filming the Beatles' Christmas show in December of '64. It was after McCartney had already bought his Epiphone Texan acoustic, so he was familiar with the quality of Epiphone. Paul would later use the Texan to record Yesterday. The Casino was right-handed, and Paul bought it because he was dead set on finding one that had a Bigsby on it. He paid £172, or about $480 at the time. He used the Casino extensively with the Beatles and in his solo career, and he still owns the guitar to this day. He said in many interviews that it remains his favorite electric guitar. Lennon and Harrison would buy their casinos in the spring of 1966 as they were getting ready to record Revolver. Both guitars were built in 1965 and had the later hourglass-shaped headstock. The big difference between the John and George's guitars is that George's was the one fitted with a factory Bigsby, where John's had a trapeze tailpiece. The Casino would continue to be John's main guitar for the rest of the time with the Beatles, famously visible in the final live performance on the studio rooftop featured in the documentary Get Back. The original Casino run was from 61 to 70, and there were a number of changes across that time. The fretboard inlays changed, pickup covers on the T90s went from plastic to nickel, and a new cherry finish was introduced. The biggest year for Casinos was 1966, with 1,655 shipped, nearly double the number of 853 that had shipped the year before. It's easy to assume that this was due to both the Beatles and Keith Richards playing the guitars on tour in 64 and 65. After that original run was ended in 1970, the Casinos were then built overseas. In the wake of John Lennon's death, Epiphone honored him with 2 replicas of his Casino, one in sunburst and one in natural as the guitar appeared in its stripped finish. Manufactured in Japan and assembled in the US, the models were designed to 60s Kalamazoo specs. Production was limited to 1,965 guitars, which brings us back to 1965, perhaps the best year to be a guitar maker in the US. In addition to the British invasion and pop explosion in the US driving electric guitar sales, the worldwide folk boom drove acoustic sales as well. And then there was Bob Dylan going electric in 65 with his number 2 hit, Like a Rolling Stone, that moved him from folky to pop stardom. And the Byrds had a number 1 hit with Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, starting the folk rock boom as well. But the new competition for the entry-level market coming out of Japan began to be felt in the US, and sales for Gibson and Epiphone fell 20% in 66. The secondary blow was that Ted McCarty, seeing the writing on the wall, left Gibson in 66, ending what many considered to be the golden age for both brands. Though Epiphone had started with Gibson as their budget brand, their popularity led to rising prices in the line that competed with Gibson prices in the end. By 69, production in Kalamazoo had dropped to 59,000 instruments. And though they saw Gibson with a strong future, Epiphone began to feel like a liability. It began to feel obvious that for Epiphone to survive, it had to become an import brand. Gibson had some samples sent from Japanese maker Matsumoku. Gibson exec Bruce Boland remembers that it ended up falling to him to close out the American-made Epiphones in Kalamazoo. They sold off the remaining back stock at deep discounts, and the production of U.S. Epiphones came to an end in 1970. Meanwhile, late in 69, an Ecuadorian company began buying Chicago Musical Instrument, or CMI, stock, eventually leading to a new company being formed, Norlin, the name coming from the 2 founders, Norton Stevens and Arnold Berlin. Of course, the Norlin era is seen as one of steady decline in Gibson quality, but overall the company did many other interesting things, including buying Moog synthesizers when they saw guitar sales declining and keyboards on the ascendancy. Gibson's sales slid from a rebound in 74 of 73,000 instruments to just around 33,000 instruments in 79, the lowest since the early 1960s. They were hoping to make some money with the Epiphone import scheme. Boland went to Japan and met with Matsumoku, identifying 11 of their guitar models to be rebranded as Epiphones. Just 11 models, down from the 50 different Epiphone models there had been in 1968. These were inexpensive import guitars, the most expensive of which was a classical model called the EC25 at $159, about equal to the least expensive model in the last year of Kalamazoo production. They abandoned all the old model shapes and names, and instead the new line were copies of Stratocasters and Martins. The closest thing to an old-style model was the 501T and roughly casino-like offering with a bass, the 5120, to match. In 73, Boland began to visit Japan regularly with the goal of expanding the Epiphone line. That change came in the shape of the ET-278 that looked a lot like the Crestwoods of the 60s, and later he added the ET-275. This continued in the 76 catalog with the Scroll series, which for the first time in Epiphone history sported full-size humbucking pickups. Boland also brought in import flat tops that echoed Gibson models like the Dove, Hummingbird, and J200. As the 70s came to a close, Boland was moved to be Director of Research and Marketing for Gibson and moved to Kalamazoo, and the folks that replaced him at Epiphone could never match his success. The rising cost of labor in Japan left them moving a series of guitars to be made in Norlin's Pearl Drum Factory in Taiwan. The new double cutaway Genesis guitars had a carved top and were unique to Epiphone, but the downward slide of Gibson and Epiphone in the corporate structure of Norlin couldn't be stopped. The turnaround came when in '82, Gibson decided to move to their reissue program, producing Les Paul standards, Flying V, Explorer, and even the Moderne that had never been put in production back in '58. With this new look back, they also put the light on Epiphone once again. The American series were, as the name implies, Epis built at the Gibson Kalamazoo plant. The Spirit model was designed by Bolin and had a body like a late 50s Les Paul Jr., but with one or two humbucking pickups. Priced at $475 and $525 for the single or double pickup model. They did so well that by the next year, they were removed from the Epiphone line and moved over to the Gibson line. They also offered reissues of thin-line Epis in the form of the Emperor, Sheridan, Riviera, and Casino. The Emperor was also offered as a full-depth version as the Emperor F. Meanwhile, the Norlin era was coming to an end, while Japanese labor costs were pushing import builders to move on to Korea. Norlin followed the trend and contracted with Samick to build the Epiphone line. Again, they simply slapped the Epiphone name on existing Samick models, and though they reused the old names like Crestwood, the guitar built in '84 had little to no resemblance to the model from the '60s. The '84 catalog showed pics of Epiphone and Gibson headstocks together, and that foreshadowed what was to come. Looking for a way to save the line, Bolin pulled a meeting of some of the top folks at Kalamazoo together and came up with the concept of building Epiphone versions of Les Pauls, Flying Vs, and Explorer. But the idea fell flat with upper management until another change in ownership in '86 brought it back to the table. In 1986, 3 former Harvard Business School classmates purchased Gibson and Epiphone from Norlin. Things had slid so far that though Norlin was originally asking $15 million, the partners only had to pay $5 million for the entire company. Of the 3, Juszkiewicz and Berryman ended up running things, and it didn't take long to realize that import guitars were ruling the day in the '80s. Like Bolin before him, Berryman took a trip, this time to Korea to visit Samick, and much like Bolin, made up an Epi line from existing Samick models, adding the Epiphone name to the headstock. The very Strat-like S-series, running from the S200 up to the S600, were very familiar. But unlike Bolin, looking into Epiphone's past for additional models, Berryman rounded out the line in '86 with a Flying V and an Explorer-style guitar. This move to copying Gibson models in the import market echoed what Fender was doing with their Japan-built Fender guitars. Now, just as Fender customers could buy an inexpensive Strat, aspiring Gibson players could buy an inexpensive Les Paul. By '89, the line bragged of its ties to U.S. production, even though only one of the models, the Pro, was made in the U.S. But this marked the first American-made Epi in 20 years, and perhaps most importantly of all, 1989 was the first year that Epiphone would produce a Les Paul Standard and a Les Paul Custom. Aside from the logo and the headstock shape, the Les Pauls looked just like their Gibson counterparts. The Epi catalog even featured a testimonial from Les Paul himself, a relationship that Juszkiewicz had rekindled upon acquiring the company. He also reconnected with Chet Atkins, and they offered a country gentleman a Tennessean-style guitar under the Epiphone brand. And last but not least, Epiphone brought back a Howard Roberts signature model that would evolve from the new Fusion to Fusion 2 and Fusion 3 models. In a separate catalog, the Acoustic Collection, they added a 16-inch jumbo body SQ-160, which had the double overside pickguards of Gibson's Everly Brothers model. In '91, they brought back a US-made Coronet. It was a mashup of the '60s body shape with modern electronics and a reverse headstock shape that frankly made it difficult to tune. Perhaps more importantly that year, they brought out an Epiphone Joe Pass Emperor model. In jazz circles, Pass was seen as the consummate jazz guitarist with influences from Django Reinhardt to Charlie Parker. A Joe Pass model at an import price point was the entry-level jazz box for students everywhere. In addition, they launched their first SG models in '91 with the G400 and G310, both stripped-down versions of the Gibson Classic. All of this success showed prominently in sales. When the partners bought the company in '86, Epiphone sales were at $1 million annually, but by '91 they had risen to $10 million annually. Seeing this, they decided to pay more attention to the line and opened an office in Seoul so Epiphone personnel would be closer to the point of production. Berryman hired Jim Rosenberg to shepherd the brand. In '93, Juszkiewicz suggested that they do a run of vintage-style Epiphones that would be built in the U.S. plant right next to their Gibson counterparts in Nashville, just as they'd done in the late '50s and '60s in Kalamazoo. In addition, they did the same with the flat-top Excelente, Frontier, and Texan up in Montana, each with a run of 250 guitars, and every one sold. On the opposite end of things, they offered the LP100, a Les Paul-style guitar, but with a cost-saving bolt-on neck design. By the next year, they'd started producing the successful Chet Atkins solid body steel and nylon string guitars in the Epiphone line as well. In the mid-90s, they brought former Doobie Brothers and session guitarist Jeff Skunk Baxter on board for an acoustic electric, the PR5E, and later a less successful solid body electric, the Baxter Master. The momentum seemed to be infectious when Gibson realized that the blues royalty John Lee Hooker had been using Epiphone Sheridans in his comeback. They brought him into the family as well. In '95, Epi released a version of Gibson's Nighthawks, Firebirds, and Thunderbirds, along with Les Paul basses, a viola-style bass, and an Elvis J200. '97 saw the introduction of Noel Gallagher's Supernova, a mashup of features from Rivieras and Sheridans that had been built in Japan. It had a stop tailpiece, double parallelogram inlays, and a light blue finish, invoking Gallagher's favorite soccer team, Manchester City. Epiphone rolled out the Jack Cassidy bass with its gold top finish and unique low-impedance humbucking pickups and three-way Veritone control. Like they had done in Japan before, production now was moving from Korea to China and Indonesia. In 2002, Epiphone incorporated in China and announced the opening of the new plant in Qingdao. Trained in part by craftsmen from the US and from Korea that had been building the guitars on import for decades, the new factory moved rapidly from the easiest bolt neck models to the Masterbuilt series. We saw the introduction of the Cat series guitars, the Alley Cat, Flame Out, and Wildcat, small semi-hollow guitars with a decided rockabilly vibe. In 2004, a short-scale Alan Woody Rumble Cat bass was added to the line. By 2003, Made in Japan had taken on a sign of quality, and Epiphone turned to Terada and Fujigen to launch a new high-end line called Elite. A trademark issue with the name came up, and the line was rebranded as the Elitist guitars. The prices ranged from $1,500 for a plain top Les Paul Standard to $2,700 for a Birdland-style guitar. These prices were double what they were charging for the guitars built in Qingdao, but they included US wound pickups and higher quality hardware, and they quickly gained a reputation for excellence. My buddy David Barber owns an SG-style Elitist guitar that he says is every bit as good as any American-made Gibson that he owns. Nick Valencia, the band The Strokes, had a Riviera Epi signature guitar with P94 P90 style pickups in the full-size rings, both built in the Elitist series in Japan and then in a production run in China. By 2008, Epiphone had opened a second factory in Qingdao to keep up with demand. In 2010, we saw a Zakk Wylde Epi-only model called the Graveyard Disciple. Authorized copies of the Gibson models continued to drive most of Epiphone's sales. It seems that most everything we see from Gibson finds its way as an Epiphone counterpart at an entry-level price. Even the move to produce a scaled-down ES-style guitar in the Gibson 339 saw counterparts in the Epiphone catalog. But there have also been some interesting revivals. In 2021, a USA Casino was produced in small numbers by Gibson in the Nashville factory, and a USA Texan followed in 2022, made in Bozeman, Montana. At the more affordable end of things, Noel Gallagher's signature Riviera has sold like hotcakes, thanks to the Oasis man's endorsement and the band's reunion. The 150th anniversary of the brand has given Gibson a chance to remind the world of Epiphone's unique additions to the guitar world, including the Crestwood, Sheridan, and Wilshire. The biggest news is the Inspired by Gibson collections launched in 2020, and the move to Epiphone's headstock gaining a more recognizable open book shape, what they call their Kalamazoo headstock, as it's based on the Epi headstocks we'd seen on the earliest Casinos. Add in genuine rosewood fretboards, thinner nitrocellulose finishes, and you're dealing with a guitar that competes well with similar Gibson models. Some folks question blurring the lines between the two brands and offering more affordable, less recognizable Epi versions of the classic Gibsons. But I nod in appreciation that competition, even within a company, is good for business. And ultimately, building Epiphones like they were in the golden era is good for all of us. So who's your favorite Epiphone artist? Put in the comments for everyone to enjoy. If you like this video, you'd probably enjoy my short history of Ibanez guitars. I need to thank John Cordy for his permission to use clips of him playing various import and US-built Epiphones over the years. I also need to thank Carter Vintage for sharing playing examples of Epiphone guitars. And I can recommend Walter Carter's The Epiphone Guitar Book as a great resource on this subject. I want to thank everyone that stopped by the online store and grabbed some merch or a 5 Watt World Barber Collaboration overdrive pedal. You keep the channel going. And in particular, I need to thank my friends of 5 Watt on Patreon as the guitar community I've always wanted. You're all 5 Watt World. I just make the videos. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. Thanks for hanging with me until the end. Until next time, I'm Keith Williams. Thanks for being a part of the 5 Watt World.